The Bismarck Sea looked calm that morning until the horizon erupted in fire and steel. 8 transports gone, 4 destroyers sunk, over 3,000 men left thrashing in blood-red water. And then came the chilling order. No survivors. What drove Allied commanders to unleash such ruthless fury? And why is this story still hidden in the shadows of history? The waters of the Bismarck Sea lay deceptively calm on the morning of March 3rd, 1943. A faint mist hovered above the surface, carrying with it the acrid scent of fuel and smoke. Across the waves, debris floated endlessly, splintered beams, twisted steel, shattered lifeboats. And among them, thousands of men, Japanese soldiers, stripped of their rifles, their uniforms soaked with oil, their eyes turned upward at the sound that now ruled the sky. The heavy roar of American engines, the whistle of machine gun fire descending once more. Moments earlier, the sea had erupted into chaos. Transports groaned and cracked apart under the impact of bombs that skipped across the water like thrown stones. Destroyers shuddered beneath the fury of strafing runs, their decks swept clean by streams of .50 caliber fire. The air reeked of cordite, and the cries of the drowning mixed with the thunder of engines circling overhead. What had begun as Japan's desperate gamble to reinforce New Guinea had dissolved into a nightmare of fire, steel, and blood. Yet the most haunting chapter was still to come. For those who clung to rafts, for the soldiers gasping between waves, survival was only an illusion. Orders had been given. No survivors. Allied aircraft banked low once again, their guns leveled not at ships but at the men in the water. In seconds the sea erupted with crimson streaks, lifeboats shredded into splinters, and bodies sank silently beneath the surface. It was more than victory. It was annihilation, and it would leave behind questions that echo through history. Was it necessity, or was it vengeance? To understand how the Bismarck Sea became both a triumph of innovation and a moral scar upon the Pacific War, we must turn back to the beginning. By early 1943, the tides of war in the Pacific were shifting. Just months before, Japan had seemed unstoppable. Its armies had swept across Southeast Asia. Its navy had struck fear from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea. Yet, by the beginning of that year, cracks in the empire's armor were showing. Guadalcanal had bled Japanese forces dry, draining men, ships, and aircraft in a campaign that ended in retreat. For the first time, the myth of Japanese invincibility had been broken. Still, Tokyo clung to one last hope in the Southwest Pacific, the rugged island of New Guinea. From its northern coast, Japanese forces could threaten Australia itself. Reinforcing that front was seen as vital, not just for strategy, but for pride. High Command ordered a bold move. Thousands of troops from the elite 51st Division would be carried by sea, across waters prowled by Allied aircraft, to the garrison at Lae. It was a decision forged in desperation. The alternative was to march through 140 miles of fetid jungle, a death trap of disease, starvation, and exhaustion. The sea seemed the quicker path, but the sea could also betray them. Behind Japan's gamble lay its faith in a doctrine inherited from an older age, the decisive battle, or Kantai Kessen. Victory, the admirals believed, would come not through attrition, but in one thunderous clash that shattered the enemy fleet. It was a philosophy that had shaped Japanese naval thought for decades. Yet in the skies over New Guinea, doctrine meant little. Land-based bombers and fighters could project power in ways no battleship could shield against. Air superiority, not surface might, was the key to survival. On the other side of the front, the Allies were learning fast. General Douglas MacArthur, tasked with defending Australia and retaking the islands, demanded results. His air commander, Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, was determined to deliver. He had arrived to find a demoralized force. Pilots frustrated by outdated tactics, bombers missing moving ships by miles. High-altitude precision bombing, the doctrine once worshipped, had proven useless. Less than 1% of bombs found their mark. It was a staggering failure. But Kenney was no prisoner of tradition. He welcomed innovators, and among his officers was one man whose fury at Japan burned as fiercely as his genius for invention. Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Once a Navy pilot, Gunn had seen his wife and children trapped behind Japanese lines in the Philippines. Every raid he planned, every weapon he modified, carried the weight of that personal vendetta. For him, war was not abstract. It was intimate, and he would change the very way American bombers attacked ships. While Japan prepared its convoy, loading transports with soldiers, ammunition, and fuel, Kenney and Gunn prepared something new. A weapon forged not in factories, but in workshops, with imagination as its fuel. Medium bombers, once dismissed as too small, too weak, would become predators. Their noses bristled with guns, their tactics turned upside down. The Americans would no longer rain bombs from the safety of the clouds. They would skim the waves and strike like hunters with claws unsheathed. The stage was set. On one side, Japan's faith in doctrine and the desperate hope that speed and courage could outpace Allied air power. On the other, a reimagined air force, wielding innovation as its sharpest blade. The Bismarck Sea would soon become the crucible where these visions clashed, and only one would emerge unbroken. The B-25 Mitchell was never designed to be a ship killer. It was born as a medium bomber, a workhorse meant to strike factories, rail yards, and fixed targets. Yet in the crucible of the Pacific War, it would be transformed into something entirely new. A predator of the seas. The transformation began in the hands of Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. He was no ordinary officer. Gunn had once been a Navy enlisted aviator, a man who lived and breathed machines. He could tear an aircraft apart, rebuild it, and then fly it harder than anyone else. When war erupted, his personal tragedy gave his work a darker edge. His family, his wife, and children remained trapped in the Philippines under Japanese occupation. Every bullet he fired, every innovation he crafted, carried the weight of that loss. For him, the fight was not theory. It was vengeance. The B-25's nose held the key. Traditionally, a bombardier would crouch inside, peering through the Norden bomb sight, calculating angles, altitudes, and release points. Precision bombing was supposed to be a science, but against moving ships, it was nothing more than guesswork. By the time bombs fell from 10,000 feet, their targets had already slipped away. Gunn tore out the bombardier's position. In its place, he installed a wall of firepower. 8 forward-firing 50-caliber Browning machine guns, mounted in the nose and cheek pods. Each gun spat nearly 850 rounds a minute. Together they could hurl almost 7,000 rounds of metal and flame into the enemy in just 60 seconds. Enough to shred a ship's superstructure. Enough to silence its gunners before bombs even struck. These modified Mitchells became flying gunships, heavy, brutal, and devastating at close range. Pilots quickly learned that their role was no longer distant bomber, but hunter at wavetop height. They roared in just above the sea's surface, salt spray slashing at their windshields, engines straining against the drag. Then came the bombs, not dropped from the clouds, but hurled like stones across a pond. Skip bombing. Released at less than 250 feet, the bombs would bounce across the water's skin. 1, 2, 3 skips, before smashing into a ship's hull just above the waterline. Armor that had been designed to resist plunging fire from above was useless here. Steel plates buckled, compartments flooded. Ships died in minutes. To make this deadly ballet possible, training had to change. At Port Moresby, pilots of the 90th Bombardment Squadron drilled endlessly. They aimed not with delicate bomb sights, but with reference points scratched into their cockpit glass. They practiced again and again, diving low toward a half-submerged wreck in the harbor. Each run demanded perfect timing. Released too early, the bomb would skip harmlessly past. Too late, and it would slam into the target itself, often with catastrophic results. One crew was killed outright when their Mitchell struck the wreck's mast. Yet the survivors pressed on, day after day, until accuracy became instinct. They no longer thought like bomber crews. They thought like knife fighters. The Australians added their own blade to the arsenal. The Bristol Beaufighter, twin-engined, armored, bristling with cannons, was built from the start for destruction at close range. 4 20mm cannons in its nose could blast through armor, shredding gun crews and equipment. 6 additional machine guns only deepened the storm. Their job would be to go in first, raking Japanese decks with fire, silencing the anti-aircraft weapons. Then, the Mitchells would strike. It was a choreography of death, each move timed to the second, each roll vital to survival. As these innovations took shape, the mood among Allied crews shifted. No longer did they feel like blunt instruments, lobbing bombs in vain at agile ships. They had become specialists. They held in their hands a weapon tailored for the very threat they faced. For the first time, the men of the 5th Air Force believed they could not just harass Japanese convoys. They could annihilate them. What emerged in early 1943 was more than a modification of metal. It was a revolution in thinking. A doctrine rewritten not by theorists, but by men with grease on their hands and vengeance in their hearts. And soon, this creation would be tested against flesh, steel, and the unforgiving waters of the Bismarck Sea. On the night of March 1st, 1943, under the cover of storm clouds rolling across the Bismarck Sea, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura's convoy slipped out of Rabaul. 8 transports packed with nearly 7,000 soldiers, ammunition, fuel, and supplies. 8 destroyers formed a protective screen, their wakes glowing faintly in the moonlight. The men aboard these ships knew they were part of something more than a routine mission. They were the last great reinforcement to New Guinea. Success meant Japan could hold its ground. Failure meant collapse. On deck, soldiers of the 51st Division huddled together. The air was thick with sweat and diesel. Some whispered prayers to their ancestors. Others smoked in silence, staring into the black horizon. Beneath their feet, the holds groaned under the weight of crates, shells, rations, and dreams of survival. They had been told the sea crossing was safer than the jungle march. Yet every man knew the danger. Somewhere out there, American aircraft prowled like wolves. Kimura himself stood on the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki. He had fought in the battles around Guadalcanal and seen firsthand what Allied aircraft could do to ships caught in daylight. His own hands had pulled survivors from burning waters. Now, as lightning flickered across the sky, he hoped the weather would cloak his ships long enough to reach Leh. But luck in war was fleeting. At dawn, March 2nd, the clouds began to break. American reconnaissance aircraft were already in the air. From the Allied base at Port Moresby, long-winged PBY Catalinas lifted off, lumbering into the sky. Their mission was simple: find the convoy, shadow it, report its every move. They could stay aloft for more than 20 hours. Slow, vulnerable, but persistent. The hunters had spotted their prey. In his headquarters, General George C. Kenney studied the photographs. The grainy images showed transports clustered together, destroyers cutting across the waves in formation. To Kenney, it looked like a gift, the decisive blow he had waited for. He called his commanders, his voice sharp with conviction. Tomorrow the skies would burn. Tomorrow the new tactics would prove themselves. Back at sea, tension thickened. On March 2nd at 10 o'clock in the morning, 8 B-17 flying fortresses appeared high above the horizon. Engines droned like thunder. The Japanese opened fire, their anti-aircraft guns barking defiantly. Bombs tumbled from the sky, streaking down toward the convoy. The sea erupted in towering plumes. Water rained down upon the decks, spraying faces already tight with fear. One transport, the Kyokusei Maru, took a direct hit, shattering into flames. She sank quickly, taking nearly 400 men with her. Survivors were hauled aboard destroyers, crowding their decks. For Kimura, the first blood had been drawn. He knew it was only the beginning. That night, the convoy pressed on. The sea was restless. The men restless still. Crammed aboard destroyers already carrying double their capacity, soldiers tried to rest on open decks, slick with seawater. Some clutched rifles as though steel alone could keep death at bay. Officers muttered about the Americans' growing air power. None spoke openly of despair, but it hung in the air like a storm cloud. Far above, Catalinas circled, radioing the convoy's position every hour. Their pilots knew they flew within reach of Japanese fighters. Yet they held on, determined to keep the enemy under watch. Each transmission drew a noose tighter around Kimura's formation. Every mile forward brought the transports closer to Leh, but also deeper into the trap. As dawn broke on March 3rd, the sea was calm, the horizon clear, the sky mercilessly blue. Kimura's heart sank. Clear weather was a curse. He ordered his ships to tighten formation, anti-aircraft crews at the ready, gunners scanning the skies. Over 6,000 men stood just 60 miles from their destination. Yet they were already ghosts in waiting. At Port Moresby, engines roared to life. Bowfighters, B-25s, A-20 Havocs, all rising into the morning air. The hunters were coming. They would strike not from the heights of doctrine, but from the edge of the waves. For the Japanese convoy, the long journey through storm and darkness had ended. Ahead lay sunlight, and with it, destruction. The morning of March 3rd, 1943. The horizon shimmered with heat. The Bismarck Sea stretched wide and deceptively peaceful. But to the men aboard Admiral Kimura's convoy, that calm was an omen. Lookouts scanned the skies with straining eyes. Gunners clutched the grips of their weapons, sweat slick across their palms. Then, faintly at first, the deep, rolling growl of engines. The sound swelled, a vibration in the chest, a hum that became a roar. The hunters had come. At wavetop height, 13 Australian bowfighters swept into view. Their twin engines thundered low, wings almost brushing the waves. To the Japanese, the sight was shocking. These were not bombers gliding from high above, but predators racing in at eye level. The bowfighters attacked in unison, a wall of steel descending upon the convoy. 4 20-millimeter cannons in each nose spat blazing shells. Explosions ripped across decks. Anti-aircraft crews cut down before they could even aim. Machine gun nests shredded. Gunners hurled into the sea. The air filled with splinters of wood, shards of metal, fragments of men. Survivors would later recall the bowfighters' passes as storms of fire that no ship could resist. The plan worked. While Japanese defenders reeled, The next wave arrived. 12 B-25 Mitchells, modified into gunships, bore down on the convoy. Flying at just 30 feet above the water, they seemed impossibly close, their noses blazing with .850 caliber Brownings. The sound was like canvas tearing apart, a relentless rip that devoured everything in its path. Bullets chewed across the hull of the destroyer Shirayuki. Officers on the bridge fell where they stood. Admiral Kimura himself staggered back, blood blossoming across his uniform. Fire control equipment smashed into ruin. The ship was blind, its guns silenced. Moments later, the bombs came. Released low, they skipped across the water like stones hurled by a giant's hand. One struck the Shirayuki's side, detonating beneath her waterline. A column of water and steel erupted skyward. Compartments flooded instantly. Men swept away in torrents. The destroyer shuddered, twisted, then broke apart. Flames engulfed the decks. Screams vanished beneath the roar of the sea. The transports were even more vulnerable. Designed for cargo, not combat, they were death traps once targeted. The Teiomaru groaned as gunfire raked her hull. Soldiers packed in her holds had no escape. Bombs slammed into her sides, tearing gaping holes. Water poured in. Hundreds were trapped below decks, their cries muffled by rushing seas. Others leapt overboard, clutching fragments of wood, only to be cut down by strafing runs. Within minutes, the vessel sank, leaving behind nothing but oil, bodies, and drifting wreckage. Across the convoy, chaos reigned. The Arashio tried desperately to maneuver, her gunners firing blindly at shapes screaming past. A bomb struck amidships, tearing her apart. Flames rolled upward as men dove frantically into the sea. The Yukikaze, one of Japan's most battle-hardened destroyers, fought to save survivors while weaving under relentless attack. Even she could not shield the transports. One by one, ships were struck, burning, sinking. Each explosion shook the water, waves rocking survivors like rag dolls. From above, the spectacle was apocalyptic. B-17s hammered from altitude, their bombs crashing down in great plumes, scattering the convoy further. A-20 Havocs added to the storm, racing in low, adding yet another angle of fire. The Japanese were trapped in a deadly geometry: high, low, side, front. Every second brought new destruction. Smoke rolled skyward, thick black plumes smothering the blue. Beneath them, the sea turned red with spilled fuel and blood. On the decks of sinking transports, soldiers clutched at rifles that could not reach the sky. Some shouted prayers, others curses. Many jumped, the water welcoming them with bitter cold. For a fleeting moment, the sea seemed safer than the burning decks. But safety was an illusion. Allied aircraft circled relentlessly, engines droning like vultures above a battlefield. By mid-afternoon, the outcome was clear. All 8 transports were either sinking or aflame. 4 destroyers lay shattered or gone beneath the waves. Survivors clung to rafts, oil drums, planks, anything that would float. The sea itself was now a graveyard, dotted with heads and hands waving weakly against the tide. Kimura, bloodied and broken, had been pulled aboard another destroyer. From its deck, he looked out at the devastation. His mission, to deliver reinforcements, was over. What he saw instead was annihilation. But the battle did not end with the sinking of ships. The next phase was darker still. Allied commanders knew thousands remained alive in the water. If they reached shore, they would reinforce Japanese lines. General Kenny's order was cold, clear, unforgettable. I want every goddamn Japanese in the water killed. I don't want any of them reaching shore. The phrase spread among air crews like a curse. Some accepted it instantly, hardened by months of combat, by memories of atrocities committed against prisoners. To them, The men below were not shipwrecked survivors. They were enemy soldiers. Others hesitated, haunted by the thought of firing on men stripped of weapons. Yet orders were orders. That afternoon, bowfighters returned. They descended low over rafts and lifeboats, cannons roaring, wooden craft splintered, bodies hurled into the sea, ammunition cooked off, explosions rocking the survivors. The water turned crimson. American B-25s followed, their machine guns stitching across rafts, across men swimming desperately. Reports spoke of lifeboats definitely put out of action. Cold words, masking the horror. Night fell, but even then the sea offered no mercy. American PT boats prowled the wreckage, their machine guns firing at point-blank range. Japanese submarines tried to slip in, to rescue who they could, but under constant air patrols their efforts were meager. Hundreds were left to drown. For the Japanese, the Bismarck Sea had become a nightmare without end. For the Allies, it was a victory beyond expectation. The convoy had been erased, annihilated so completely that Tokyo could scarcely believe the reports. Yet for the men who fired the guns, who strafed the lifeboats, memories lingered like scars. Some defended their actions as necessity. Others carried shame for the rest of their lives. In the end, the climax of the battle was not just the destruction of ships. It was the sight of the sea itself transformed into a vast canvas of wreckage, oil, and death, a place where innovation had triumphed, and where morality had drowned alongside the men of Japan's 51st Division. The Bismarck Sea, once calm and endless, now seethed with wreckage. Smoke rose in black towers, drifting across the horizon. Oil slicks stretched for miles, shimmering in the sunlight, broken only by the pale faces of men clinging to debris. Nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers had begun the voyage. Now thousands floated helplessly, their fate sealed not by the sea alone, but by the steel wings circling above. For Admiral Masatomi Kimura, the reality was crushing. Wounded, blood seeping through his uniform, he stood on the deck of the destroyer Shikinami. Around him, survivors clawed at the rails, begging to be hauled aboard. The destroyers had been built to hold barely 240 men. Now each vessel carried double, even triple that number. Bodies were lashed to the decks, tied down simply to keep them from slipping back into the sea. Every corridor, every corner overflowed with wounded and desperate. Rescue had become suffocation. On the Allied side, word of victory spread quickly. General George C. Kenney read the reports with grim satisfaction. The mission, he told his staff, had not ended with sinking ships. Survivors were soldiers. If they reached Leh, they would return to the fight, prolonging the campaign. His deputy, Major General Ennis Whitehead, pushed the point harder. The phrase used was clinical, mopping up operations. But every pilot knew what it meant. Lifeboats, rafts, and survivors were now targets. On March 3rd, bowfighters returned. Flight Lieutenant Ronald Urin led his squadron low over the drifting remains. Cannons roared again, splintering wooden rafts, shattering boats crowded with soldiers. Explosive shells ripped men apart, the water boiling with blood. Pilots described scenes they would never forget. Faces turning upward in terror, arms raised in surrender, then erased by fire. Some flyers justified it as duty. Others swallowed bile, haunted by what they saw. The following day, American B-25 crews received the same orders. Captain Charles Howe of the 90th Bombardment Squadron later wrote of firing 2,500 rounds into clusters of lifeboats. In his report, the phrase was chillingly simple. Personnel in the water were definitely put out of action. A euphemism that masked the brutality. For those in the cockpit, It was the language of survival. For those in the sea, it was annihilation. The campaign lasted 3 days. PT boats prowled at night, their machine guns flashing across the dark waters, finishing what the bombers began. Japanese submarines slipped in under cover of darkness, desperate to pluck survivors from the carnage. They managed to save only a few hundred. Thousands more were abandoned, left to drown, starve, or fall beneath strafing fire. When the sun finally set on March 5th, the sea was silent again. Silent, except for the debris, the oil, and the dead. For Tokyo, the news was staggering. 8 transports gone, 4 destroyers lost, over 3,000 men dead, many more wounded or missing. Entire units of the 51st Division erased before ever setting foot in New Guinea. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto called it unbelievable, a crushing blow. Japan had gambled everything on one last convoy and lost it all in a storm of fire. The Allies celebrated. MacArthur hailed it as one of the most complete and annihilating victories of the war. Newspapers splashed headlines of Japanese destruction, proof of Allied dominance in the skies. Yet behind the triumph lay unease. Some airmen boasted of their success, convinced they had shortened the war. Others spoke only in whispers, unable to reconcile duty with the memory of lifeboats erupting under fire. The battle had secured victory, but left behind scars that would never heal. The immediate effect was clear. Japan could no longer reinforce its positions in New Guinea by sea. Every large-scale transport was doomed to be hunted down, annihilated by land-based aircraft. From that day forward, supplies would trickle in only by submarine or by barges creeping along the coast. The decisive blow had been struck. Strategically, the Bismarck Sea was a turning point. Yet morally, it was a wound that would bleed for generations. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea ended in smoke, wreckage, and silence. Yet its echoes would ripple far beyond the waters of New Guinea. For the Allies, it was more than a tactical triumph. It was proof that innovation, when fused with desperation, could change the face of war. For Japan, it was the death knell of its ability to move armies across open seas. And for the world, it raised questions about morality that could not be ignored. Strategically, the impact was immediate. With 8 transports and 4 destroyers lost, Japan's merchant fleet was crippled. Already strained by American submarine warfare, the empire could no longer replace such losses. More devastating still was the lesson burned into every commander's mind. Convoys were no longer safe. Allied land-based aircraft ruled the skies, their reach stretching across the Pacific like a shadow. From that day forward, Japanese reinforcements would trickle in only through barges, submarines, or the jungle's unforgiving trails. The grand designs of holding New Guinea collapsed. By September, Leh had fallen. The dominoes continued to topple, one stronghold after another, until Japan's southern frontier lay shattered. For the Allies, the battle validated the unorthodox. Skip bombing, once dismissed as reckless, now stood as doctrine. The B-25 Mitchell, reborn as a gunship, proved that aircraft could combine precision, firepower, and speed in ways that rewrote the rules of naval warfare. The innovations of men like Paul Pappy Gunn and Ed Larner would influence aviation design for decades. The lessons learned in those waters would echo into the A-26 Invader and into the jet age that followed. Technology in the hands of the daring had changed destiny. But there was another legacy, a darker one. The strafing of survivors, conducted over 3 relentless days, forced the world to confront the boundaries of total war. At the time, no international law forbade such acts. Survivors were seen as potential combatants, Military necessity blurred the line between victory and atrocity. Yet after the war, as nations reflected on the horrors committed on all sides, that ambiguity would not stand. In 1949, the Geneva Conventions enshrined protections for shipwrecked personnel, making clear that the sea could not be turned into an execution ground. The memory of the Bismarck Sea lingered in those deliberations, a silent witness to the cost of vengeance. For those who lived it, the legacy was deeply personal. Some Allied pilots defended their orders as necessary. Others carried them like a weight, a shadow across the years. Japanese survivors, few as they were, never forgot the terror of the skies above. History would record the victory as decisive, but the morality as contested. In the end, the Bismarck Sea was both triumph and scar, a battle that revealed the power of innovation and the cost of abandoning mercy. A reminder that in war, victories can be absolute, yet still leave behind questions that echo long after the guns fall silent.